Good evening. Thank you for coming and welcome to the University of Melbourne and the Centre for Advancing Journalism. My name's Margaret Simons, I'm Director of the Centre, and it's my pleasure tonight to introduce our speaker, the Managing Director of the ABC, Mark Scott. But first, a few housekeeping matters. The hashtag for tonight's event, for those of you on Twitter, is ScottNewNews. That's Scott New News. I would also very much like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which this event is taking place, the land of the Wurundjeri, and pay respect to their elders and their families. I should also say, particularly since tonight's speech is likely to cause some controversy, that this event was originally conceived as a debate. As you'll know, there's been quite a lot of debate in the National Daily about the role of the ABC and the appropriate role for its journalism in particular. So we invited the Editor-in-Chief of The Australian, Chris Mitchell, to debate Mark Scott here tonight. He declined. We invited Paul Kelly, the Editor-at-Large of The Australian. He didn't reply. We invited the CEO of News Corporation, Julian Clark. He declined. And the former CEO of News Corporation, Kim Williams, who also declined. We do hope to have all of those people, or at least some subset of them, here at the Centre at some future event to talk about some of the ideas which are being debated tonight. The ABC, though, I think it's fair to say, stands at an important point in the future of Australian journalism, and perhaps journalism beyond Australia's shores as well. It is the biggest single employer of journalists in Australia. It's always at the heart of controversy about the appropriate role for government-funded journalism and government-funded media more generally. And of course, particularly at this present moment, it's at a difficult time in its history, and I'm sure that high on the list of priorities for Mark Scott will be the forthcoming budget. And I don't know whether he'll have anything to say about that tonight. Mark Scott himself has got a long background in media. He was previously at Fairfax, and he's been Managing Director of the boss of the ABC since 2006. So he is in fact coming towards the end of his second 5-year term, a particular juncture in Australia's history, in the history of journalism, and in the history of the ABC. So it's going to be an interesting night. Mark has agreed to take questions at the end of the session. You should be aware that tonight's event is being recorded, so if you ask a question, that will be recorded. I would ask that you wait for the microphone to get to you as well. I will recap on these points before we take questions. But for now, it's my very great pleasure to introduce Mark Scott. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Margaret. And can I begin by acknowledging the traditional owners on the land in which we meet and pay my respect to elders past and present. It's a great honour for me to be back at the University of Melbourne to explore again some of the issues that are shaping the future of media organisations and our ongoing challenges about how to practice great journalism in these turbulent times. Nearly 5 years ago, I was here delivering the A.N. Smith lecture, which I entitled The Fall of Rome. In referencing Auden's poem, I looked at why empires fail, in this case, media empires, and why those empires struggle to deal with the revolution brought about through digital technology. The evidence that was clear then is even clearer now. Organisations that were once dominant in an era of few providers and many consumers have faced enormous challenges adjusting to the realities of the new market and the dramatically devalued advertising dollar within a digital media world. Decades of great success and long-established market muscle meant there was so much to lose by moving away from those traditional pillars of strength. That loss of the ability to shape the world as you wanted it to be came as a surprise. The intruders were coming silently, quickly, and in vast numbers to reshape the industry and to reshape our world. Now, the thesis that I articulated then was hardly radical. Clayton Christensen, in his definitive text, The Innovator's Dilemma, had explained it well. There were countless examples of iconic brands like Kodak and Xerox that failed to see what the technological changing world meant for their business models. Larry Page, the co-founder of Google, told the TED conference last month, "The main thing that has caused companies to fail is that they missed the future." I find it startling to consider the evidence in the 5 years since I gave that speech, what has happened in the Australian media landscape since, and just what the last 5 years have meant to this industry. The changes have been so sweeping and dramatic, it's quite compelling to document just some of the evidence of this revolution in our midst. 5 years ago, my focus was on the disruption of the old. Tonight, the focus is on the eruption of a new vitality, new techniques, and new skills for digital journalism. At a corporate level of media organisations, the impact of recent years has been profound. You know, we have speculation about whether the market can sustain 3 free-to-air television networks, with Channel 10 pining for the days when younger audiences were less fickle and more loyal. And while subscription levels stall, Foxtel can still transform around 30% household penetration that it claims into more profits than all the free-to-air networks combined. The last 5 years has seen a continued rollout of new devices and delivery mechanisms to make content available anytime, anywhere. None of us had seen an iPad 5 years ago, and now tablet growth is surging. Digital radio has dramatically increased the range and flexibility of services on offer in Australian mainland state capitals, proving the original wireless endures. New services like T-Box and Fetch now deliver a wide range of video content. VPNs allow Australians to access global content with ease, and at least allow some to assuage their consciences by paying Netflix for content. BitTorrent use has exploded with no payment, and one suspects no conscience pangs. And Netflix continues to shape up what we think of as television, creating a massive social buzz around programming and showing that linear broadcasting is not necessary for big audiences and industry awards. Netflix talks of more than half of television content in the US being delivered through internet streaming by 2016. The explosive impact of social media has led to so many new voices being heard, so much fevered debate around the news. And we've lived through reviews and debates about the role and effectiveness of media regulation through the Levinson inquiry in the UK and the Finkelstein review here. New competitors like The Guardian and BuzzFeed have arrived in Australia. The Daily Mail looms, as does the Huffington Post. Hulu and Netflix seem like they've been coming forever, but may, for the present, be quite happy with the subscriber levels they already have. Television is still in a ferocious battle to hold audiences in an era of fragmentation and choice. Only 3 certainties remain as a compelling live free-to-air proposition: news, sport, and whatever television marketing departments can convince you that has to be watched tonight. It's led to a bonanza for the providers of premium sports, with the latest television contracts for the AFL, NRL and cricket effectively doubling returns to those codes. And television programming has dramatically changed in the last 5 years, with the win-at-all-cost strategy of expensive, highly produced reality television formats, massively promoted franchises running many times a week, knowing that a locked-in audience will return night after night to see the souffle rise or fall, or to critique the quality of the bathroom renovation. One of the remarkable changes in the Australian television landscape in recent years has been the extraordinary success of local content in the ratings. Last year, all 50 of the top-rating programs were Australian: sport, reality and drama, and that was anything but the case a decade ago. And I might add that not one of those top 50 rating shows was on the ABC, a fact conveniently lost on those who persist in depicting the ABC as an all-conquering, audience-snatching competitor. Reality television and sporting programs dominate the top rating list. With so much global content available online and through mobile, the winning proposition in television appears to be Australian stories in a variety of forms. What remains unclear, however, is the extent to which the provision of Australian content would be assured without the current regulatory environment. Premium Australian programming may attract an audience, but the longer-term question is how long that audience can be converted into a revenue premium. As someone connected with the Convergence Review rightly remarked to me, the enthusiasm of commercial television management for local drama production wasn't always matched by their boards, who were understandably less interested in the fun of creating content, hit shows and awards, but were rather more interested in the profit there on the bottom line. So much of this change is driven by digital technology and Moore's law, empowering audiences and driving their expectations. The technology is improving at an exponential rate, impacting size, speed and capacity, and triggering a myriad of applications that place the consumer in a position of great authority. And the revolution will simply go on with faster, cheaper broadband, tablets and phones at a range of price points, and new applications like Google Chromecast and HBB TV. While all these developments are worthy of detailed investigation in their own right, you'll be pleased to hear that we don't have time for such investigation tonight. In this university centre, the transformations we are seeing in the news industry are of greater interest. And I'd like to look a little bit at what we're seeing in news and what it might mean for politics and our national conversation. Both major newspaper groups in the country are in the midst of dramatic transformations. Fairfax is on the road to becoming a digital media company, migrating its traditional broadsheets through a tabloid format while actively discussing the prospect that the day may come where they may not publish in newsprint at all, certainly not every day of the week. These were themes that Greg Hirewood addressed in his A.N. Smith lecture here at Melbourne University. The changes at News Corporation have been less visible, but arguably no less profound. Following a corporate restructure which bundled the Australian newspapers in with News's other Australian assets, including Foxtel, and with its other global print assets, the Australian newspapers are now being forced to financially perform and carry their financial weight in the organisational structure. It's difficult to get a realistic estimate on the number of jobs lost in the nation's newsrooms. Fairfax has been far more public than News on the numbers, but suffice to say that print newsrooms are much smaller now and that internally syndicated copy features much more frequently. The job cuts have been dramatic. In many cases, the newsrooms are unrecognisable. The nature and ambition of some of our key mastheads have changed. And the way organisations and audiences think of news is changing also. Of course, with all this swirling around us, it is hard to make any definitive calls. But let me offer some observations on this changing news landscape. Every day we understand more that conventions we once thought true for news have been broken in the digital revolution. We once operated in closed, managed markets with our news diets determined by news executives who controlled printing presses or had access to broadcasting spectrum. Now news markets are global, and we consume news content from around the world, not just from the world's most distinguished media organisations and its most famous reporters, but from people we've never heard of, on websites we never knew existed, yet which cater to our interests, our obsessions, or our simple curiosity. News was once timetabled and programmed. Newspapers in the morning or at night, the 7 p.m. evening bulletin on the ABC, a longer radio bulletin on local radio at 7:45 in the morning. Now, of course, some of these conventions still exist, despite the very clear public expectation that the news doesn't stop, and nor should news organisations. The expectation is that the latest, up-to-the-minute news must be available anytime, any place, anywhere, and on any device. Once there was a strong focus on breaking news, being the first with the story. the front page yarn or the story at the top of the bulletin that no one else had as it first emerged. And of course, that still matters a great deal. Every organisation wants to break news. But in a world where everyone is publishing or broadcasting through the day, your exclusive is being commoditised at remarkable speed. Once upon a time, your story was yours until the next publication cycle. Others would try and catch up and get ahead of your story by the next day. But others are now there on your patch within minutes. We have a newer phenomenon, breaking news coverage. The capability of a news organisation to be able to deliver the best coverage of a story as it evolves, the story and responses, the new information coming to light through the day, the press conference, the analysis, the audience feedback and contribution, the minute by minute. This movement from the fixed and the scheduled, with the investment made in bespoke journalism at certain times of the day, to an ability to pour out information in a flow, demands new skills and capabilities. It represents risks as well. With social media in particular, the audience can be ahead of the story. But we're not yet at the point where, as the British journalist David Hepworth observed, you will never again get the news first from a news organisation. However, the rumoured advance on a story once tightly held in the corridors of a newsroom until verified before deadline may now find itself dramatically disseminated by the public through social media before the checks are done. Being slow with the story can ruin your breaking news reputation, but similarly, a mindset that says never wrong for long doesn't build confidence or credibility in what you put to air or publish, whether you are any more than a distribution channel for what you've heard. The new storytelling has demanded new tools, particularly for online. Newspapers long wrestled with the capability of graphics, but now we look for a whole new set of digital skill sets around data visualisation, helping to deconstruct the complexity and use imagery to tell the story in the most powerful way. Like other media organisations, the ABC has recruited people with expertise in data visualisation to help us deconstruct stories and then communicate them in more effective and compelling ways. It's an encouraging development, I think, this injection of new skill sets in the newsroom and different voices in our publications and programming. Witness the great contribution to the media mix made by The Conversation as it taps into new specialist expertise in our universities for commentary and analysis with depth and unique insight. It's a model with legs, as we see, as it rolls out a UK version with the possibility of a US version to follow. And like many of the emerging websites in the US, The Conversation's recruitment of a person who needed no imperial honour to be acknowledged as the grande dame of the gallery, Michelle Grattan, has helped make The Conversation an important destination. The definition of news today is big and broad. Perhaps it was ever thus, but now there's no escaping it. Bill Bryson, in his lively book on America's Summer of 1927, writes about the rise of tabloid newspapers in the US at that time, long after their existence in the UK. Tabloids, Bryson said, were a new revolutionary type of publication that completely changed people's expectations of what daily news should be. Tabloids, he said, focused on crime, sports and celebrity gossip, and in doing so gave all three importance considerably beyond any that they had enjoyed before. A study in 1927 showed that tabloids devoted between a quarter and a third of their space to crime reports, up to 10 times more than the serious papers did. And of course, at the serious newspaper end of town, this high-selling, highly profitable practice of journalism was a direct challenge to the prevailing definitions of news and what a newspaper should be. Once again, in our time, traditional definitions are being challenged. Once again, celebrity, crime and sport feature in the revolution. Now the audience defines what the news is for them. It is no longer a diet simply served up by a handful of decision makers at our major news institutions. And for many consumers, online news has been the most wonderful innovation, allowing them to keep up to the minute with the things that transformed American newspapers in the 20s: crime, celebrity and sport. What is noteworthy now, of course, is that while we have fewer newspapers, that's all we have fewer of, because there are now countless websites and sources of news and information. What we see now is just far more of everything, from the scandalous and the salacious to the sober and the scholarly. Although I must say the scandalous and the salacious content has been enhanced by celebrities having the ability to create and distribute their own content through social media, with the injudicious Warney tweet or Miley selfie taking on a life of their own in the media cycle. One of the encouraging signs to emerge from the latest report from Pew, the State of News Media 2014, is the vibrancy of new websites recruiting senior journalistic talent and recruiting them in number. Of course, some of the growth comes from the likes of BuzzFeed with its endless provision of lists, surveys and intriguing quizzes. I'm looking forward to the inevitable BuzzFeed quiz, which Media Watch host are you? Or, for balance, which editor of The Australian are you? But even BuzzFeed is recruiting experienced journalists in areas like politics to make the site broad and encompassing as well as profitable. Also in the US, you have significant new enterprises like Nate Silver's 538, committed to injecting what he believes to be new skill sets into journalism, most notably data analysis and analytics. Quants in the newsroom find different stories and refute much conventional wisdom spouted by those who refuse to carefully analyse what the information really is telling us. We see some of this in Australia too, of course, though clearly not all, will be encouraged by the fact that The Guardian can start a local edition here and then go on to exceed audience and revenue targets, and as a result continue to invest and recruit. And I think you'd back the success of the Daily Mail here as well. They are global leaders in the news of crime, celebrity and sport kind, and some journalists in Australia are grateful for the market that the new title is creating for experienced digital journalistic talent. While some specialist-built titles like the Global Mail have not survived, other locally based franchises of international websites are giving it a go, like Business Insider. Some of our most engaging journalists have become significant media entrepreneurs. People like Eric Beecher, Alan Kohler, Mia Friedman and Wendy Harmer are backing their audience insights in pursuit of profitable niches, finding audiences willing to pay or providing more relevant eyeballs for advertisers. And we're seeing some entrepreneurs who are being successful in other sectors, like Maury Schwartz and Graham Wood, trying something new to get a foothold in the sector. The same, of course, is evident in the US, with wealthier entrepreneurs and more famous titles, like the founder of Amazon channeling some of his personal fortune into the Washington Post. Of course, the revenue models are challenging, and nothing is going to replace the glorious margins the newspaper oligopolists once enjoyed. But there is a vibrancy to the entrepreneurialism happening in the sector that runs completely counter to the gloomier views we've become used to. The web is offering, through news and information, more specialist depth and engagement around narrower areas of interest. Jay Rosen the other day said that when giving advice to journalists starting out, he tells them to start a niche news service on a subject some people care a lot about, providing what his colleague Lisa Williams describes as a narrow comprehensiveness. So as the Pew report indicated last week about the American market, there is an energy to the news industry not seen in a long time. Even as challenges of the past several years continue and new ones emerge, the activities of this year have created a new sense of optimism and perhaps hope for the future of American journalism. Much still remains unknown. 5 years ago, I questioned the capacity of newspapers to make people pay for content through paywalls. Of course, it is hard to get through the spin any great insight on performance, but paying audiences we know have been slow in coming, and no one says it's easy. The once unthinkable now seems likely at some point with Fairfax, as the creation of the tabloids and the closing of the big printing presses seems set to be a forerunner of the shutting of print editions altogether on some days of the week, at least at the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age. It is now a digital media business, not a newspaper business. The great unknown and the great risk is the size of newsrooms a digital-only business can maintain, and whether the digital businesses are strong enough to sustain a grip on audiences without the daily printed artefact. Still, I think that you would argue that their digital success over the past 5 years has increased the likelihood of the mastheads enduring in some digital form, irrespective of print. One of the things evident in the demise of newsroom staffing has been the departure of many great reporters and writers, particularly those with a depth of experience in certain subject areas. There are far fewer specialists writing for the papers now in defence and national security, in health and education, in medicine and science. Many of the great reporters took the cheque and left. Now, numbers of them still write, but often they are for blogs or of sites of narrow comprehensiveness that have a fraction of the audience and therefore little of the broad impact their old publications and audiences could deliver. Great stories that once may have been swept up across the media are now discovered by fewer, albeit interested, well-informed and grateful readers. I have an untested hypothesis about what's happening in our news environment with the scaling back of investment in traditional newsrooms, the proliferation of new competitors in news services and the roar of voices on social media discussing the news of the day. There does seem to be more focus on news than ever before. No longer a news cycle, but a river of news that flows forever on. What remains to be seen, however, is whether the new arrivals are able to break and set major news agendas. Of course, there are stories and campaigns that have broken through from the news services and blogs. But at the moment, the main news that's deconstructed, the one driving broad shared interest and attracting audiences of scale, is still coming from the long-term traditional news providers. The news each night or published each morning or on radio bulletins still seems dominated by events everyone has or stories that have been broken and then disseminated from major media organisations. These major media organisations may have fewer resources, but they still have more resources, more reporters to do the digging and a greater capacity to distribute at scale. What dominates conversation on Twitter and so many of the blogs is in response to what's in the news, feeding off something that's already been broken or revealed elsewhere. It is lively and opinionated, often lucid and thoughtful, but most of it, is derived from a traditional news diet. Part of Twitter's key strategy is to be an accompaniment to other media, as a partner, not the main event. It means, surprisingly I think, that while the big commercial media organisations may be less profitable and are continually struggling to monetise, they remain robust in setting and shaping a media agenda, in defining the news and providing a focus for the rest of the media ecosystem to follow. And if they are breaking fewer stories or missing major stories because of a cutback in the investment in journalism, it may just be that the rest of the ecosystem swirls around a less substantive core of news. Given the aggressive editorial positioning of some of their mastheads and their willingness to adopt and pursue an editorial position, an ideological position and a market segmentation, you could argue, I think, that News Corporation newspapers have never been more assertive in exercising media power. This is worth reflecting on when thinking about life without Fairfax in print most days of the week. News Corp currently sells around 70% of papers purchased in capital cities in Australia, and with the exception of the Financial Review, is already a monopoly provider in Brisbane, Adelaide and Hobart. With Fairfax perhaps retreating to a weekly edition at some time in the future, fairly conservative modelling could see that figure at closer to 80%, with Perth the only capital city without the News Corp monopoly through the week. Now that is good news for News Corporation shareholders. The American evidence suggests that newspaper markets in most cities are shifting towards monopoly papers, and that in a reasonably sized city, a single paper should be able to make a financial return. The reason it feels like the media battle is being waged as though it's a winner-take-all is that's exactly what it is. Now, people will draw their own conclusions about what this means for public debate and the contest of ideas. It might be that all the new arrivals and strong voices find a place of agenda setting and influence, new central players in the media ecosystem. A range of influential voices has always been seen as a safeguard for the effective working of the media ecology. Rupert Murdoch saw it this way. As he said to the ABC in 1967, and I quote, "I think the important thing is that there will be plenty of newspapers with plenty of different people controlling them, so that there's a variety of viewpoints, so that there's a choice for the public. This is the freedom of press that is needed. Freedom of press mustn't be one-sided just for a publisher to speak as he pleases, to try and bully the community." I'm grateful for Media Watch for discovering that clip from 1967. Now, it's true to say that in this era there are a variety of voices, but there will not be plenty of newspapers with different people controlling them. The newspapers that survive will be powerful. The return of Lachlan Murdoch to his position of power in the family business was clearly a significant news story, not just for his company, but for our society. We will all watch to see how he wants to exercise that power. The television market is different again. For at least two of the three commercial networks, as is the case with the ABC, the news is a consistent high rater. And there are more news products out there now, earlier bulletins in the afternoon and evening and new ones on the multi-channels. And as is the case in the US, dominance at breakfast news television has proven to be important to branding and news presence for commercial television in Australia. Gavin Morris, a senior executive in the ABC News division and a driving force behind the creation of News 24, remarked some years ago that for all the revolution in Australian television coverage, TV news had remained remarkably unchanged since the early days of colour television here. That's changing now though, with slick production and presentation, sharp graphics, more live reporting, more anchoring from the field. And this is happening on the commercials as well as the ABC. Commercial networks know that winning in news gives you a platform to promote viewership throughout the evening, and they invest accordingly. I would argue, though, that what the ABC is offering and what the commercials are offering is increasingly different. While not solely focused on celebrity, crime and sport, there is no doubt that commercial bulletins will often focus on the local over the national and the international. They clearly have a capacity to focus on issues that are important to audiences and connect with their lives. The ABC, however, offers a different diet to what remains a large and appreciative audience. The gap is even greater in the area of current affairs television, I think. Commercial television simply could not maximise a return to shareholders while investing in the detailed investigative reporting that often underpins a 7:30, Four Corners or Late Line story. As Peter Meakin said some years ago, it's perfectly possible for us on commercial television to do what the 7:30 report does, but I'd have to close the show in about a month. Much of what the ABC does is just not marketable on commercial television. And nor does it need to be. And that's why our mixed model of public and private providers of news has worked so well on television. As Malcolm Turnbull remarked the other day, having a single metric, profit, makes decision-making easier for commercial media. You've got to give the shareholders what they demand, increasing returns, even focusing on that as you program news. The complexity of delivering to a charter, as the ABC does, and to the lively vocal range of stakeholders and constituents with conflicting needs makes the ABC, as the Minister said, a much harder business to manage. The rationality for commercial media interests to invest to win return will continue to be a dominant feature of our media ecology in the years ahead. While the ABC will continue to pursue a strong local presence in regional and rural Australia, commercial media outlets will find it harder to make the local news investment there, particularly as fast broadband impacts on advertising revenues. A cry for deregulation by media owners will see them push further to maximise profits as best they can, unconstrained by delivery requirements. They feel burdened by historical regulatory frameworks created in an era of low competition and very high profits, rather than the reverse of that, which we're in the midst of right now. The ABC remains such an important part of this Australian news ecology today and into the future. In all the uncertainty that commercial models have brought to this world of journalism, and all the pressure on commercial media executives to drive a financial return, the public's financial support for the ABC is one sure investment. We have continued to reinvest in our news service to bring the best return for taxpayers. Witness News 24, not yet 4 years old, but already reaching nearly 4 million Australians every week. And this is important, it was created without an extra dollar of taxpayer investment. As we have pursued efficiencies, taking advantage of technology and improved work practices, we have been able to reinvest savings to keep the ABC relevant and compelling for audiences, to improve the return to taxpayers. It's worth noting that the key elements of our reinvestment strategy, News 24, iView, and a host of online services, have proven to be immensely popular with the public. Now, the government has promised to maintain ABC funding, and we will argue that efficiencies continue to be reinvested as we become a public broadcaster in the digital era. We did receive additional funding in the last budget and have invested it wisely across a range of initiatives, such as more specialist journalists to break more news and to bring detailed expertise in key reporting rounds. We have invested in technology to allow us to bring more stories from around regional and rural Australia to national audiences. Our news websites are being overhauled to ensure we can deliver the best local, national and international news to audience members, tailored to where they live and work. There is a greater focus on breaking news stories, not just in our outstanding current affairs programs, but across our news services and radio services as well. Bold experiments like Vote Compass during the last election campaign have seen unprecedented levels of engagement from the public, with 1.4 million completed online surveys before the last election, giving remarkable insight into the mind and mood of the electorate. Of course, our work is subject to scrutiny, evaluation, and at times criticism. But frankly, most of that comes from within. The ABC board is an outstanding group of eminent Australians, trustees of the corporation for the taxpayers, and they are determined to keep standards high, ensure the organisation is compelling and relevant, and delivering a strong return for the funds invested. And to keep our reputation by far the most trusted and respected media organisation in the country, the ABC regularly reviews and upgrades its editorial policies. In addition to regular program reviews, we have independent assessments made of our coverage, commissioned and reviewed by the board and published for the public. No other media organisation has a more comprehensive process for dealing with audience complaints and inquiries. The public understands this in a way that some of our critics do not. Phil Coorey recently wrote in the Financial Review about research by the renowned political pollster John Scales, who was with Crosby Textor. And Scales researched about the issues the public thought were really important. Of the top 10 issues in the survey, community and social issues were the fifth most important, rated by 44% of voters. The pollsters then quizzed this 44% on which community and social issues concerned them. Coorey reported that out of 25 community and social issues, biased reporting by the ABC rated, as he put it, stone motherless last, with just 1% citing it as a concern. We are concerned about the suggestions of bias at the ABC, but as I've said before, I feel we're nowhere near as bad as our critics make out, but not always as good as we'd like to be. And that is why we audit and review. That is why we work hard on training and development. That is why we set the highest newsroom standards in the country. And it's why the ABC remains the most trusted and respected source of news and information in the country. It is a fact confirmed in nationwide polling time and time and time again. And while there will be stories that we need to clarify and correct, and there may be a story that some audience members may disagree with, the audiences know that overwhelmingly the news and public affairs content put to air by the ABC is delivered by a team of serious professionals committed to high editorial standards and committed to delivering the story in a way to meet the needs of the audience, not simply with an eye to winning the ratings, having the best share of advertising, or improving the financial return to the owners. The ABC remains the only sure bet to invest in quality news and current affairs in prime time every night of the week, to ensure we tell the stories from local voices in our cities and in regional and rural Australia, to invest in foreign bureaus in Asia and around the world. We will tell the important stories even if we know that the ratings will dip or the critics will bark. We've always seen some programming targeting certain audience demographics. However, as media markets continue to fragment in this digital era, with audiences and advertisers having so much choice, the push to target content to profitable niches will grow. I expect that we'll see in the Australian market what's happening in the US and the UK. Market segmentation in news based around specific political and ideological perspectives. As Fox News has shown in the US, it's a way to make very significant money while others around are struggling. The ABC, on the other hand, will always want and need to be a broad and inclusive media organisation, aiming to be the nation's town square where all people can come to speak and be heard, to listen and to understand. Our channels and platforms are now, more than ever, the place for the robust contest of ideas. Right across the ABC, we've embraced the many new opportunities that digital media has presented for our audiences to participate in the conversation. The ABC even seems to go out of its way, as is often pointed out to me, to put its critics on air to talk about their concerns about aspects of our programming and operations. I think it is important that as Australians we have this public space, this commons. From the largest cities to the most isolated communities, we tell the stories of the nation. They are stories that inform, educate and entertain us in the grand tradition of public broadcasting. And we do so knowing that this is what the Australian public, who pay for us, who are our shareholders, who are our owners, we do this knowing that that is what they want us to do. And we remain more than ever a sure bet in the midst of this current media storm. I'll pause there and look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Mark Scott. That's deeply appreciated for you to share those thoughts with us tonight. Now, we will take questions for about a quarter of an hour. A few rules. Could we please have questions, not speeches or statements? And I will intervene if we do get speeches and statements. Also, would you please wait for the microphone to come to you before you start speaking, and remember that you are being recorded tonight. Can I see any questions in the audience? Yeah, we have one right there in the middle from the gentleman in the green shirt.
Hi, Mark. Thanks for the great speech. Just interested, what are the new news sources that you personally follow? Like, what are the? Are you on like Reddit or is it just Crikey, or like what do you read personally?
Well, I mean, I suppose like many people, I have, 10, 15, 20 favourite websites that I'll go to and visit every day. I'm struck how often I start with Google News. All that information pouring in and that algorithm sorting out for me under subjects that I've searched for, what they're looking at. And then I think I go to all the main news websites in Australia, major news websites, I suppose, around the world. And I do think that Twitter's great achievement is as a news feed. I remember back when I was news editor of the Sydney Morning Herald, I used to sit at the desk, and one of the advantages of being news editors, you'd sit there and watch the news come in, and you'd subscribe to these services. And some like AP or AFP and others would flow by the minute, the way Twitter does, and others would dump in a big block. But you had a sense as you were watching it that you were really plugged into things that were happening around the world, and you'd see a story and you'd immediately react to that. And, Fairfax at the time was paying hundreds of thousands of dollars for my privilege to be plugged in to what was happening around the world as I did that job. Now, of course, anyone can get that. And I still find, the single most interesting thing that happens, I think, around Twitter is that momentum that happens around a big breaking news story and all the tension that involves around what is factual, who you're trusting, what is verified. And, I think that surprisingly to me, as I've seen that service evolve, but you've seen more media organisations on it, more verified accounts on it, almost official feeds from media organisation. That's become part of the media mix that I explore as well.
Okay. We have another question in the middle here, and then yes, sir, after that, the gentleman in the black T-shirt first.
I wonder what you think is the future of investigative journalism.
Yeah.
You've made some reference to it in relation to 7:30 Report and Four Corners. But in the broader media, the private sector media, what do you think is the scope for journalists who dig deep, who range wide, who take time to follow a lead, as we have seen in the past?
Yeah, I think all major media outlets still want a great exclusive story, and often your best exclusive stories come from detailed, time-consuming investigation. But I think it's expensive. It represents risk, and part of the risk is that they don't come back with a great story, that you say at times it's like a venture capital fund in a way. You've got to actually spend the time, make the investment. You'll get big returns at some times, and other times you won't. And I think with constrained newsrooms, with newsrooms that are much, much smaller than they once were, your ability to free people up for the time to do that, I think, will be harder. But it's why at the ABC we're deliberately investing in the kinds of people who can do that and trying to create programming opportunities for them to do that. A few interesting trends, though, I think. One is I think you'll see more organisations work in partnership. Over the last year or two, the ABC has done significant investigative reporting with Fairfax, with News Corporation, done stories with The Guardian, and I think the right kind of partnership between different media organisations, bringing different skills together and then sharing that investment cost might be more that we see. And I think you can clearly see outside traditional media, groups like the group that Jared Rowell is working with in the US, and there will be other forms of deep investigative work that I think takes place from almost organisations that are set up and funded to try and do that. But I think when it comes to mainstream media, the newspapers, television news channels and the like, it is harder, clearly now, to free up the people, to free up the time to do the detailed investigations. I suppose another kind of optimistic side to that, though, is that I often used to think journalism was a group of people who really didn't know what was going on. They were the people in the newsroom, and the news was all out there, and part of the challenge was to try and find those stories. And I do think the benefit of being in an online connected world and the opportunities that can come from crowdsourcing information. You look at some of the stuff that the UK newspapers did about using their audience to dig through and find stories within great data dumps. I think there are other ways of doing investigative reporting that are clearly advantageous now in the digital era.
Thank you. We had a question from the gentleman here, and then we'll go to you, ma'am.
Speaking on Sydney radio, the Prime Minister, Tony Abbott, has made a number of comments about the ABC, most notably the ABC being on Australia's side. Do Mr Abbott's comments ever make you, as the Managing Director, nervous?
It's a good question. Any other questions we've got? One of yours is in, Margaret, I think. Look, at times I get comforted when I look at the history of the ABC, because if you look at, Ken Inglis wrote 2 volumes of history of the ABC, and is often the story of challenging times that exists between governments, prime ministers, and the ABC of the day. And often, I was at a function at Parliament House a few weeks ago, and I commented that at times it feels like the ABC is most unpopular within the boundaries of Parliament House, and that's irrespective of who's in government. And their focus is often on about 2% of our content. But often that focus will be on content that we're doing what we're meant to be doing, taking nothing for granted, asking tough questions. And some of our stories will irritate and frustrate and annoy. But that's us doing what we need to do. And so I think that politicians are absolutely welcome and entitled to provide whatever critique of the ABC they wish, and if you look back through the years, they always have. But I think politicians also understand that the way the ABC was conceived and the way the ABC has developed and evolved, and as is enshrined in legislation, there is the great strength of the ABC comes in its independence. And that independence is really entrusted to the eminent Australians who serve on the ABC board. They safeguard that independence, and that's why it's been a tremendous model here that whilst politicians of either side might criticise, it's up to finally the editorial judgment within the ABC, safeguarded by the directors, that keep the ABC independent. And that's what makes it so valuable and so trusted and so respected. And so I noted the Prime Minister's comments. He said actually that he has a love-hate relationship with the ABC. At times it's best, it's terrific. At other times he wants to throw a shoe at the television set. And I thought, well, that's what I have too, quite frankly. At its best it's terrific. It's not always at its best. But, I welcome the debate and the discussion. And I've always welcomed a robust, fair-minded discussion about the role and purpose of the ABC.
The lady there.
Given the role of the ABC and its purpose, how would you rate the newsworthiness of a compelling kind of tabloid drama such as Chappelle Corby? Because that got a lot of coverage on the ABC 24.
Yeah, it did actually. And I got hostile letters from people I knew quite well saying, why Chappelle Corby? And it's kind of interesting debate, I think, for our news editors. I think... for whatever reason, Chappelle Corby captured public imagination. There were, I think, significant debates that emerged around what her fate and treatment would be given what was happening in the relationship with Indonesia. There'd been extensive coverage of the family. And I think for us not to have done Chappelle Corby would have exposed us to criticism that we were elite and out of touch, basically, with the issues that people were talking about. And so what we try and do, I don't think we do, we didn't do round-the-clock coverage as some of our colleagues did, but I think, we had to recognise that this is what people were talking about. There was a level of interest, and we needed to report that in our own way. And when I wrote that back to some of the people who, some agreed and some disagreed, but it's ever been thus around news judgment. Finally, it's a judgment. But they're the things I think we need to consider. And I actually don't subscribe to the view that says because we're committed to a strong mix of local, national and international, because we respect the intelligence of our audience, because we want to do ambitious storytelling, that we should therefore be in the margins or the side eddies. I think there are big, significant audiences for us by having that approach that we have. And you look at, particularly Melbourne, there's many a time the ABC wins the ratings in Melbourne and gets more, bigger audience than any of the commercial networks here. And I think it's partly about trying to get that mix right and not being too elitist and out of touch, but nor doing what the commercials do.
Another question? Yes, Darryl?
What do you think will happen with the ABC budget come May?
Well, should be a pretty simple story, really. We're 1 year into a 3-year tri-funding agreement, and that's an agreement that's formed with the government of Australia, and clearly the government has changed, but it's a 3-year funding commitment. The Prime Minister said before the election, after the election, most recently in Parliament a few weeks ago, no funding cuts to the ABC. And I suppose what I'm simply saying is we take him at his word, we think our audience takes him at its word. That was a clear commitment that was made, and so that's how we work and plan accordingly. I think I'd say, and as I said in the speech, there is a debate around efficiency, but I think what media organisations have to do is change. They have to respond to the demands of audiences and the new demands that we have for either new services or services delivered in new ways. And we appreciate in this funding era there'll not be new funding from government, and I think the Prime Minister was also pretty clear about that. So we need to be able to find efficiencies and reinvest them in new services. And if, for example, we had not been able to keep that money that we efficiently found and reinvested, then there wouldn't be an iView and there wouldn't be a News 24. Now, iView is now tracking at 22 million plays a month. It's by far the biggest and most successful catch-up service in the country. And not all of them are Peppa Pig viewers either. You know, it's enormously successful, just as News 24 really has very strong audience figures now and is very different to what Sky offers. There's plenty of room in the market for both. And so our argument is we need to be able, if we find efficiencies, we need to be able to reinvest to renew the ABC.
Lucy?
Thanks. There are a few Peppa Pigs coming out of my house, I can assure you.
If you don't know who Peppa Pig is, then you're just in the wrong demographic, because there are other people in this room who know that Peppa Pig is the single most important character in their household to keep their children under control. Peppa Pig, it's an enormously successful children's television program.
So you talked about services like Netflix, where people can essentially use a proxy service to access a service that's supposedly only for people in another country. I suppose the inverse of that is that people in other countries can access iView in a similar way. I wonder what impact is this having on what impact is it likely to have on the delivery of content and the buying and selling of content? Yeah.
Look, I think there are two issues around privacy, really. I mean, and one is the BitTorrent end and the other one is the VPN approach. And I think the VPN approach around something like Netflix still has the content owners being paid for that, because people are subscribing, they're just using a VPN to subscribe. And I think the people who are most upset about that are the people who think they have exclusive rights for that content in this market, and that would be Foxtel. I think, you know, I'm still expecting that, you know, the piracy thing will be a very difficult thing to solve. And inevitably what happens over time, you already see it happening, is almost global day and date release of content in multiple formats. You know, I just think the evidence around, you know, audience behaviours around Game of Thrones and things like that is the audience will not wait and they will find a way. And it's why you know, I think the BBC was quite amazed when we went to them and said, we want to show Doctor Who, the minute the credits finish in London, we want to be having it on iView in Australia. And they pointed out that it's 5 o'clock in the morning. We said, we know it's at 5 o'clock in the morning, but the Whovians will be up. And unless we are providing it to them, they will be finding their own way to access it. And so, look, I think that's for a lot of that major franchise content. That's what you're going to inevitably see, I think, over time.
We've got time for just one more question, I'm afraid. There's a gentleman right up the back there and with his hand up.
Mark, my question is about, you talked about how there's such an atmosphere of change and the constant need to reevaluate what's happening with media, but you also talked about how much strain there is on the resources of media organisations and journalists in particular. I'm wondering, in that environment, how do you make sure you keep getting fresh new eyes and new skills to reevaluate what's in front of you?
Yeah, it's a good question. I must say, with this funding that we received last time, we really went out of our way to recruit good people, recruit experienced people, but also we went looking in different places. You know, we recruited for new bureaus that we opened up in Ipswich and Parramatta and Geelong, and were really quite struck at the different people who emerged who wanted to work in those places. So much so that when we did another intake at the beginning of the year, we went back to that pool of people. And I think diversity in the newsroom, people with different life experiences, different ethnic backgrounds, different cultural backgrounds, is so important. And it's so important, I think, because different people from different life experiences bring different insights into what's news and what is stories. And I think this is quite a big issue for our newsrooms and for every newsroom. Do we really have a deep empathy and insight for what our audiences are experiencing? So we have systematically looked to broaden our recruitment techniques. We also have a more systematic approach to briefing our staff around research, around the mind and mood of the electorate and the nation, and have some leading qualitative researchers who are coming in and just trying to kind of make sure that we're not being too narrow in framing what news is, too narrow in our storytelling, that we really do have an idea of what our audience is thinking is important, not just what we think is important through our own life experiences. So this has been quite an important issue for us. I don't think our newsrooms have been as diverse as they should have been. I think we've been slow in making that journey to a more diverse newsroom, and that's a priority for us now.
Okay, well, I'm afraid that's all we have time for in the way of questions, though I'm sure we could go on all night. And just to prove how newsworthy Mark Scott can be, there is already a news story in The Guardian in Australia about tonight's speech, and I gather one is under preparation for The Australian, and perhaps elsewhere as well. So you can read all about what was said, having heard it for your very own ears. I'd like again to thank Mark Scott for attending tonight and for taking your questions. I'd also like to thank the staff of the Centre for Advancing Journalism, particularly Lucy Chancellor-Wheel, without whom nothing would ever happen, Louise Wilson, the business manager, and Brad Buller, who is manning the microphones. I've lost sight of him, but he's here somewhere. And also I'd like to acknowledge the founder of the Centre, Michael Gawenda, who's sitting in the front row here tonight. We have many of the students from the Master of Journalism at the University of Melbourne in the audience today. Your course would not exist without Michael Gawenda, who's sitting there, so I'd also like to acknowledge him. But most of all, thanks to Mark Scott for a courageous speech, and one which I'm sure will be making news for a few days. Thank you.